Brother Joseph, I was just handed the sample articles for the next Times and Season.
You know, William, some days I just don't have enough time to read every article from the Times and Seasons. I should have you read these for me.
Oh, I'll tend to that. Brother Joseph, these gentlemen would like a word with you.
Certainly.
Ah, Mr. Smith. It's a pleasure. I'm Wilbur Fugit. This is Dr. Harris.
Mr. Fugit, Mr. Harris. Where are you from?
We're from Kinderhook. We're just simple folk looking for some honest answers.
Wouldn't have it any other way.
A couple weeks ago, an associate of ours had us help uncover a mound. We went about 10 feet deep, and we discovered this.
Oh, what's that?
We don't know. We're hoping you can tell us.
When you peel back the pre-Columbian history of the United States, you might just find the Book of Mormon. Hidden in the Heartland. The story of the Kinderhook Plates is one of the least known, yet more controversial in LDS Church history. For critics, it is the last nail in the coffin of proving that Joseph Smith was a fraud. But a careful study of the evidence reveals more questions than answers.
So, 1843, Kinderhook, Illinois was and still is a relatively out-of-the-way place not too far from the Mississippi River. It was an area actually where veterans of the War of 1812 had been given tracts of land to settle and farm or live on as a result of their serving in the War of 1812 for the United States fighting Great Britain.
Peter Alter, historian at the Chicago History Museum, shares the account that surrounds one of the artifacts from Mormon church history, the last existing Kinderhook plate.
What we know about the Kinderhook plate is always murky. The thing that we know for sure is that it's not real. Beyond that, the chain of custody and other sorts of things like that, we're not too sure.
Utana Jessup of the Ancient Historical Research Foundation provides a different perspective surrounding the history of the Kinderhook plates.
In 1843, Southern Illinois, a man named Robert Wiley was very curious about the mounds in the vicinity. There were some very large conical mounds, and he wanted to know what was in there.
There's anti-Mormon feelings throughout western, southwestern Illinois. And so a group of men, a fairly large group, as many as about half a dozen, who seem to have been led by a gentleman by the name of Robert Wiley, developed a scheme to fake what became known later and what we believe are 6 Kinderhook plates. He claimed that he had a dream that there were some ancient tablets buried on his land.
So one day he went out and he goes to the largest one and dug down from the top. It started to rain as well, and it rained for almost a week. And when he decided to go back out to the mound, he let 2 friends in on what he was doing and asked them if they could come and help. Well, the day that they had arranged to go out there, he gets there and all these townspeople are there ready to help. Apparently his friends told friends, and it turned out to be quite a sizable group. They went out to the mound site, they widened the hole, they dug down, and came to this bundle of plates.
So, of course, these conspirators were using mid-19th century metals. So these were not ancient metals. Of course, they were also using mid-19th century etching techniques, specifically some kind of 1840s acid etching technique.
After the plates were taken home by the doctor, they were cleaned, so the hieroglyphs came out and people could see that this was a very interesting find. They put them out there. There were articles in the newspaper. They showed them around. Literary friends were passing them around. They were hoping to find someone who would translate them, who could translate them.
And of course, faking the whole thing. They said, lo and behold, look at these. We should take them to the prophet Joseph Smith in Nauvoo and ask him, with his knowledge of ancient languages, to translate them. As far as we can tell from research in the late 20th century, that the translation never happened.
A friend ended up taking them to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith took a look at them. He called for his lexicon and looked at some things, and then he said, well, I can tell you this much. They contain the history of the person with whom they were found. He was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth. That is the only, that preliminary translation is really the only translation we have so far.
A document was signed by 9 men, a certificate stating a confirmation of their story to the world, published in several newspapers. The 9 say they uncovered an Indian mound, and at 10 feet discovered rock and ashes. Under the ashes was a skeleton, attached to which was a set of 6 plates with unknown writing.
Wiley, he ended up giving or selling them to Professor McDowell for his museum. Professor McDowell, during the Civil War, he was a Southern sympathizer. The Iowa Regiment moved into his museum and sacked the place. So the plates from that point, they were lost for several years. No one knew where they were.
In the late 1880s, they were sold to a local candy maker and wealthy collector of historical relics by the name of Charles Gunther. When Mr. Gunther actually purchased them in, I believe it was about 1889, the seller claimed that they were, that the one tablet that Mr. Gunther purchased was a tablet from the Book of Mormon. And that's actually how Mr. Gunther put them on display in his museum. Now, Mr. Gunther had some very legitimate artifacts, like the Lincoln deathbed, that we have here as our star artifact. But he also had some other fraudulent and often entertaining and sometimes biblical artifacts. For example, the skin from the serpent that tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden. He claimed to have that in his collections. He also claimed to have the fleece from Little Bo Peep's lamb. He also claimed to have relics from the True Cross, and he also claimed to have the knife that Lady Macbeth used to kill King Duncan, of course, in Shakespeare's classic play Macbeth.
One of them made their way back through these different hands and ended up in the Chicago Historical Museum, which was exciting to come across what we hoped would be an actual Kinderhook plate, but there's only one, and that opened it up for studies to be done so that we could see if they were real.
The substances that it is made of are not ancient metals. They are mid-19th century metals. That is based on the fact that the metal is relatively pure. Ancient metals were not pure. They were a mixture of many metals. And the other scientific debunking fact was that the etching, so the gibberish on the two-sided plate, is done with a mid-19th century acid etching technique. And so those were the two things that Dr. Johnson from Northwestern University in 1980 was able to decide by a very small amount of destructive testing of our Kinderhook plate.
In early Mormon church history, the Kinderhook plates were looked at as proof of the validity of the Book of Mormon. After the death of Joseph Smith, the plates weren't even a topic of discussion for quite some time, and since 1980, the LDS Church has officially deemed the remaining Kinderhook plate a fake, and the few accounts of translation, especially recorded by William Clayton, as simply a mistake.
In the late 19th century, there was one confession. Wilbert Fugate did confess to the faking of the Kinderhook plate.
In 1879, Wilbur Fugate was corresponding with an anti-Mormon friend and telling a little bit of the story. And what he claims in that letter was that he and his friend Bridge Whitten, who was the local blacksmith, and Robert Wiley himself, the discoverer of the plates, he claims in this letter that the three of them fabricated the plates as a joke on Mormonism.
It wasn't quite a deathbed confession, but I think it was along those lines. He was certainly later on in his years, and it was much after the 1843 faking of the plates.
So he says, Bridge Whitten cut them out of pieces of copper, and according to him, Wiley and I etched them with acid, and he tells the whole procedure there. And then Wiley took them the night before and he dropped them into the hole where they'd been digging so that when everyone showed up the next day, they would find them.
The confession letter, the unknown translation, and the makeup of the remaining plate itself collectively had become a sore spot for the church. But just as there are holes in the story of the Kinderhook plates, there are also holes in the stories debunking their validity.
We need to take a good look at that. Is that really what happened? Fugate says that that's what he did. But first of all, he said that they were cut from copper. The plate in the Chicago Historical Museum is brass. Fugate goes on to explain that after they make these plates, then they use an acid and lead and some old iron, and they make some rust, and they put the plates together with rust. And then they took some pig iron and made a ring and some clasps to hold it together. And he says, we put some acid on that, and then Wiley, the night before, rubs it in some dirt and drops it into the pit. Right on that certificate it says that the ring and the clasps crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. Now, how do you make pig iron disintegrate like that overnight? It was accepted. It was accepted from the get-go, from all those around, that these were genuine plates. After Joseph Smith takes a look at them and gives this preliminary translation, that would have been the perfect time for them to expose the joke. Who waits 36 years to expose your grand scheme, and then only in a letter to a friend, only after the others that were involved have died, and there's no one to even point the finger at?
With holes in the second-hand admission of tricking the prophet Joseph Smith, a real examination should come not only of the fake plate that rests in the Chicago History Museum, but of the letter that many have leaned on to discredit the plate. This letter of admission was written as a response to a request from James T. Cobb. Cobb was a stepson to Brigham Young and a sympathizer to those who fought against the church. Many of his pursuits consisted of disproving the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. And what of the plate itself? When comparing the actual plate in the museum with the facsimile in the Times and Seasons, quite a few differences arise that could change the meaning of the characters.
We have made efforts to compare the plate that we have here at the Chicago History Museum to those copies, and whether those copies are legitimate or whether it's just difficulty in matching gibberish to gibberish. We were not able to make a one-on-one match at all. Perhaps someone studying them more closely could, but we were not able to do that.
And as far as the translation itself, Some say that Joseph never used the power of God to translate the one segment of the Kinderhook plates, as he did with the Book of Mormon, but that he simply saw characters on the plates that resembled images from previous translations. Recently, LDS historians have found a possible match. The following characters broken down from the prophet's notes coincide with the quote from William Clayton's journal that states, "He was a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that received his kingdom from the ruler of heaven and earth."